You're all very welcome to our webinar, Making Remote Work. It's very much a changed environment for remote working in the last 18 months. I suppose before COVID, at European level, it was identified that over a third of jobs that are out there could actually be worked remotely. Yet there was only 6% of the workforce were actually working remotely on a regular basis. COVID very much changed this. It fundamentally changed the way people were working. Much more than a third of the people were working remotely at that stage. And it threw up an awful lot of, if you like, benefits for people, but equally challenges on the other side that people had to come to terms with. Now, at this stage, with the rollout of the vaccines, we've got to a point where we're actually at a crossroads. We could drive on with the agenda, resolve all the issues, and make remote working a key part of life going forward. Or we could just revert to the old ways and go back to a situation where everyone goes back to the office. We're stuck in traffic jams, and the potential for rural areas is lost. So we've brought together a group of panelists here today who have a lot of expertise in the area, who have various aspects of promoting remote working over the last number of years. So we'll just introduce them to start with. First up, I have Lisa Tillyman Sorensen, who represents the Association of Danish Small Islands, and she's going to look at the idea of rural and remote communities. Then we've Chris Hurd, founder and CEO of First Base, who supplies equipment, physical equipment and services to remote workers. We've Maeve McElwee, who is Employment Relations Director with IBEC, the Irish Business and Employers Confederation, and she'll talk about employment issues. And finally, we have, this event has been organised by Grow Remote with ourselves with Grow Remote. And Tracy Keogh, who is one of the co-founders of Grow Remote, will give us some insights from the Grow Remote perspective as well. But before all that, we have our keynote speaker, and I'm truly delighted to have the Vice President of the European Commission, Dubravka Šuica, with us here today. She's co-author of the long-term vision for rural areas. This is a strategy that's been put together to determine the future of rural Europe over the next 2 decades. So we're delighted to have her here. From our perspective, I suppose, remote working has a big potential for cities and suburbs, but it could make a profound difference to rural and remote areas, reinvigorate them and bring them, if you like, reverse the brain drain that we've seen over a long number of years. So at that, I'll hand it over to the Vice Commissioner and let her take it from there. Thank you.
Thank you. Good afternoon to everybody, dear honorable members, dear ladies and gentlemen, dear Mr. Markey. You know that this commission prioritizes the demographic issues affecting people's lives. Rural areas are important from the demographic point of view, as they are the places facing the most profound effects of the demographic transition we are currently experiencing and undergoing. Remote work can be important for developing quality jobs in rural areas and countering depopulation. This is why I wanted to talk to you about rural areas today. Let us start with the fact that rural areas are home to almost 1/3 of the Union's population. We talk about 137 million people, covering 80% of the Union's territory. Rural areas are key to achieving the Union's sustainability goals. They provide us with food, sustainable raw materials, water, and biodiversity. Rural areas give us carbon sinks, travel opportunities, and also tourism. Some rural areas face dramatic population decline. This is often accompanied by the growing demographic trend of aging of the remaining population. I also look at rural areas and other issues from a democracy perspective. Democracy and demography do not exist in a vacuum. They are complementary and cross-cutting. We must respond to the needs of these 137 million citizens to avoid them feeling left behind by the democratic institutions that serve them. This is potentially one of the many subjects for deliberation in the Conference on the Future of Europe, for which I am responsible in the Commission. We are committed to addressing the challenges and opportunities facing rural areas. We came forward with a communication on the long-term vision for rural areas on the 30th of June. We ensured full participation of almost all commissioners and commission services because we wanted a communication that could be truly visionary. From the very beginning, our ambition for this vision was to go beyond any individual policy area. Our vision was to bring together all relevant policies for the benefit of rural areas. We came up with a comprehensive and holistic approach to produce something innovative. And the result is an action-oriented communication entirely dedicated to rural areas. We have worked not only for the rural areas, but also in partnership with them. We organized an extensive public consultation. We ran a specifically designed Eurobarometer survey and organized many events dedicated to rural areas. Across the European Union, national and local levels all over, this participatory approach is not over. With this vision, we are launching our Rural Pact. In a very tangible manner, this pact brings together all levels of administration and relevant players for making rural areas attractive places to live and work. We have carefully looked into the various challenges that rural areas face, such as demographic change, the problem of low connectivity, or limited access to services. It is important that we create new opportunities that can make rural areas even more attractive, more vibrant, and more dynamic. Crucially, this transformation will maintain the essential character of rural areas. We explored these opportunities through the lens of the green and digital transitions. In addition, we are building on the lessons learned from COVID-19, which have highlighted some advantages of living in rural areas. This vision is constructed around 4 pillars, namely stronger, connected, resilient, and prosperous rural areas. And it is underpinned by an accompanying plan with actions rolling under the flagship projects. This plan is not static. It is dynamic and adjustable because we are presenting a roadmap for the next 20 years. So we need to ensure that there is enough flexibility built in to tackle head-on any challenges that may evolve and which we cannot necessarily anticipate right now. This need for flexibility and foresight is one of the lessons of COVID. I want to highlight how much this vision is just the beginning. It is a strong signal to show how much we care about our rural areas, how much rural areas are our key partners in the green and digital transitions, and how all our ambitions are achievable, but only if we partner together. And to conclude, I will conclude this introduction with the very first sentence of our vision. Our rural areas are a core part of the European way of life. This vision is indeed about who we are and who we want to be. We very much count on the Slovenian Council presidency to take this topic fully on board and to help us develop it in the right direction. I also count on your support as we deliver on this ambition for our rural areas. So looking forward to your questions. I'm at your disposal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. We're delighted to have you here, as I said, and it's very timely that you mentioned the conference on the future of Europe, because I think it is something that will be very important in terms of how we can feed in terms of the potential for rural areas to be regenerated by remote working, which will be very important. But I have a couple of questions here for you, just that may be relevant. Following the launch of the vision for the long-term vision of the future of Europe, what action does the Commission plan on to increase the connectivity of rural areas and make them more suitable for remote working?
Interesting question. The key requirement for digital transformation and remote working is internet connectivity. All of us know. The flagship Rural Digital Futures proposes a set of actions to boost the sustainable digital transformation of rural areas. And our goal is to reach the European Union connectivity objective for broadband internet and for broadband networks. By 2025, all European households, rural or urban, should have access to internet connectivity, offering at least 100 megabits per second. The vision's accompanying action plan also addresses digital connectivity. It looks at closing the gaps between rural and urban areas because there is a big divide, urban and rural. It also looks at enabling universal and affordable access to high-speed broadband, including 5G. The plan addresses digital technology in the context of digital innovation and new technologies such as artificial intelligence, robotics, Internet of Things solutions, and digital innovation hubs. All these innovations contribute to the development of rural areas by implementing the actions of Europe's digital decade. The action plan also has a section dedicated to connected rural areas. This area is of key interest to building rural communities through remote work. Indeed, this plan operationalizes connectivity in rural areas, and it notes the importance of improving existing transport connections, using sustainable multimodal mobility solutions, then optimization of connections and digitalization. The Commission will support rural municipalities in identifying mobility solutions, improving connections between road, rail, waterways, and air transport can help make them more accessible to rural areas. All of these activities will facilitate connectivity, which is necessary for remote work. However, with the long-term vision, we go far beyond connectivity. We will also support a number of social aspects related to living in rural areas that will make them more attractive for remote work. And if I may add, today it is not important where you are, but how well you are connected.
Thank you. Just as remote work becomes commonplace, what do you do to maintain the balance between work and family life, and how will we make that balance work in the future?
If we are serious about supporting families and family life and ensuring the long-term viability of our economy, then it is essential to create a nurturing environment in which all kinds of families can thrive. No matter what their composition is, from single mothers to recomposed families. Across the European Union, families face similar difficulties in reconciling jobs with family life. You know that there is the Work-Life Balance Directive, which aims at more flexible working arrangements and access to family leave and carers leave. The Commission is working together with Member States to ensure a smooth transposition of this directive by the deadline of the 2nd of August next year. Since COVID-19, home and work is often the same place. We must find the balance and not let work overtake family time in this new reality. Employers have a key role to play here. They can adopt family-responsive policies. Such policies can have a positive effect on employee productivity, on commitment to positive development, and they can also reduce the desire to seek other employment. Since 2018, the European Union Programme for Employment and Social Innovation has been supporting innovative projects in the area of work-life balance in the workplace. The projects involve companies, public and employment services staff, new mothers and fathers. The projects also foster knowledge and experience sharing between member states and employers. More generally, telework may allow workers to live in rural areas and only occasionally go to their company's headquarters to meet colleagues, participate in team building, or attend meetings on sensitive issues. This flexibility may increase workers' satisfaction, productivity, and resilience. And I would also like to stress the European Union's support for setting up businesses in rural areas under different European Union programs, such as cohesion policy instruments and common agriculture policy. Social partners, including employers, play a central role in the negotiation, application, and enforcement of the rules related to remote work. We must position ourselves to tackle the challenges and reap the opportunities of remote work and digitalization of the world of work. The Commission will proactively support social partners in their endeavor, facilitating discussions and the identification of best practices. This is also in line with the European Pillar of Social Rights Action Plan. I think this can conclude this answer.
Thank you. With the time we have, I think we might move at this stage today so you can hear a flavour of what the panel have to say. I really appreciate you taking the time, Vice President, to taking a couple of questions. But I think it's important that you hear what some of the panel who are here today have to say. So first up, I think we'll go to Lisa Sørensen from the Danish Small Islands to give a flavour of what your policies for remote areas will influence and how remote working can make a real difference. Lisa.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be given this opportunity to speak about the islands as an example of rural communities in this matter. My name is Lisa Tillermann Sørensen. I'm the head of Secretariat of the Association of Danish Small Islands, which covers 27 small islands without a bridge and belonging to larger municipalities. And I'm also involved with the work of the European Small Islands Federation, ESIN, and is the leader of the ESIN Policy Working Group. The small islands of Europe are often characterized by not having a bridge connection to the mainland. And this is on one hand a disadvantage, and at the same time an asset for the small island communities. The obvious disadvantages being a poor connectivity and higher prices for infrastructure and services on the islands. On the other hand, the insularity can also be seen as an advantage, for example, giving people who live on the islands a clear sense of belonging and providing a safe community close to nature. This January, we in ESIN fed into the EU Commission's invitation to participate and give input to the long-term rural vision by holding an online workshop about the future of the European islands in 2040. And it became very obvious that there are two main subjects that are common to the European islands. Despite their many, many differences, it was clear that one, the issue of poor broadband, and two, the lack of housing are the biggest challenges of the islands today. And where poor internet connectivity has been an issue for 10 or 20 years even, the other issue of housing is a relatively new challenge. 5 years ago, lack of housing was not an issue on most of the islands. There's been a change of interest in the islands, not only as holiday goals, but as a place to live and work. This had already begun before the pandemic, but during COVID, it has really taken off. We see many more people looking to settle on the smaller islands, now often bringing their work with them as full-time or part-time remote workers. And I don't think it's the local communities that are changing as much as it is a change in the mindset of the people moving to the islands. There is, again reinforced by the pandemic, an urge to live close to nature and be part of a meaningful and safe community. And this is often found on islands and in rural areas. But of course, this is to a degree a self-fulfilling system. If there are no other people living there, if there are no basic services and no digital or other infrastructure, it is very unlikely that there will be people moving in. But if you have, for example, families living in small communities, it will inspire others to come and find their own version of the good life balanced between work and family life. And remote work is essential here, as a larger and larger portion of the workforce can work from home full-time or partly. The islands have, on a more or less theoretical level, looked towards remote work as a solution for creating new jobs for the past 20 years since the internet became available to everyone. Especially the fact that commuting is avoided by remote work seems an obvious advantage for remote areas. But the change never really came in a larger scale before now with the lockdown. And with the pandemic, we've seen a major change in attitude towards remote work. During the lockdown, many employers have experienced that working from home did not mean a decrease in efficiency or quality of the work. In many cases, it has even increased the well-being of the employee, and in such is a benefit for the company or institution as well. For the company, remote work on a larger scale means that there will also be a greater basis to recruit from. So what can be done to sustain and develop the positive effects of remote work that we see right now during the pandemic? One of the fundamental preconditions necessary as the Commissioner also pointed out, is of course very basically the need for good, reliable internet connections. The quality and size of the internet connection, and might I add, the mobile phone coverage, this is also a point, varies a lot from island to island. But what is important and what should be ensured by the EU institutions is that no one is left behind. The very smallest and remote islands at the end of the line or the rural areas are often the ones where the commercial market will not ensure the implementation of the technology. It's crucial to have a plan and economic support to ensure the proper and reliable broadband for these areas. This often means fiber optic connections, and obviously sea connections are more expensive. Secondly, we should learn and wisely use the experiences we now have from the lockdown. What has worked well and what has not. Different companies and institutions have developed measures to ensure and support the social and professional network between colleagues. This should be developed and be spread out for all to learn from. And local shared workspaces should be encouraged and supported. Also, it's important to raise the general awareness of remote work and show the good examples of how both workers and employers benefit from this type of work. We must make all the combinations of remote work visible so everyone recognizes the potential and see it as examples to follow. And also, I think it's crucial to look at the broader picture of a community when looking into the hurdles and drivers for remote work. Very simply, remote workers want to live in a good place. For the welfare of local communities, I think it's essential to acknowledge the importance of voluntary organizations. These play a huge part in what makes up the good life that more and more people are looking for. The voluntary work is the backbone and what keeps the local communities thrive. But the volunteers also very often have their hands full. There should be proper resourcing, human as well as financial, for the voluntary networks locally, nationally, as well as pan-European. And learning from other islands or rural communities through these networks make us all richer. Finally, we want to welcome the new long-term vision for rural areas. This is a tool that can be used by all levels to ensure the development and the cohesion of the rural areas in Europe. And we also find the idea of the European Observatory very interesting, and just want to emphasize the importance of including local community groups in this work. It's essential to involve the local organizations, for example, networks like ESIN, to ensure that all aspects of rural areas are covered and analyzed. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lisa. We much appreciate that. I think it gives a good overview of the key priorities that are needed in rural areas. If we can now move on to Chris Hurd, who is CEO of First Base, as I say. Chris has first-hand experience of dealing with employers who are trying to provide remote services for their employees. So Chris, maybe you could give us a perspective for your end of what the key priorities are that you see coming down the road.
Cool. And I will continue assuming everyone can see the screen without pausing unless anyone tells me otherwise. So yeah, delighted to be here today. And in this, I'm going to cover how policy can drive the increase of remote jobs across Europe. As Colm said, I'm Chris Hurd. I'm the founder and CEO of a company called FirstBaseHQ.com. And we help some of the largest organizations on the planet provide a great remote work experience to global teams. Over the last 12 months or so, I've spoke to 12,500 companies with over 25 million workers have signed up to learn more about what we can do for them. And what's interesting about that is that I've had the chance to speak to around 2,000 of them and really understand the challenges and obstacles that they're facing with respect to remote. So we're going to share some of that and touch on some of those things that we've seen and what those companies need help with. Before we get into that, though, I want to start with a more personal story about why this matters so much to me and I think so many other people. This is Millie. She's my now 7-year-old daughter who you may be able to hear running about in the background. But I missed her walking, laughing, and talking for the first time due to the office. And I became a remote worker to be there as she grew up, to be closer to my family and do all the things that make me happiest. I'm from the UK. I still live and work in Scotland. And I'm building a global tech company. I've never stepped foot in Silicon Valley. I probably never will. And the reality is you no longer have to. And I think that's the opportunity that we're really talking about here. So with that being said, I'm going to touch on 10 key issues that companies are facing, which I think policy can help resolve or certainly improve upon just now. So the first thing that we're hearing from companies is their intentions to cut the offices by 50 to 70% over the next 3 years. And I think if you doubt that, ask any large company what they've done with their office space over the last 18 months and what they plan to do over the next 18 months as well. And the policy implication of this is what happens to all this pristine real estate in the middle of expensive cities, and how can we repurpose them to make cities better places to live? Slide number 2, we've obviously spent a bit of time talking about before, but it's about rural living. People want the ability to live where they want, and rural areas have been ignored for the last 50 years or so. And I think remote work can really help people live where they want. And I think in a lot of respects, that's going to lead to people returning to where they're from. Around 30% of the companies we spoke to are planning to go fully distributed entirely. They're not going to have an office. And the implication of this is that talent is going to decentralize across the rest of Europe again. And for companies, that has a massive implication with respect to access to talent. Remote companies want to hire the best person for every job rather than just the best person in the city their office is in. And this has the potential to impact the whole of Europe as talent everywhere can have the opportunity to access opportunity where they are without moving. Cutting costs is obviously a massive part of this, getting rid of the office expense and being able to pay better wages as well. Another thing that we're hearing from a lot of companies is their desire to travel. Remote doesn't mean you never see your teams. It just means that you're more purposeful about it. And I think what we'll see across the next 18 months or so, as things start to open up and restrictions lift, countries with ample high quality accommodation will attract massive numbers of remote workers to retreats. The kicker here is that it has to be easy for companies to do this and without any worries for taxation or anything else. And I think right now there's still significant concerns there. The next thing we're hearing from companies is around pollution reduction. They really care about remote work as an opportunity to cut this. And I think when you think about cutting a 2-hour daily commute for millions of workers across the EU, this has the potential of a massive impact on emissions as well. And I think in some respects, this is the biggest and easiest green revolution the fewest people are actually talking about today. Other companies, rather than remote retreats, are starting to think about this as resorts. How can they have more fixed bases that people can travel into and work from? And there are obviously innumerable places all over Europe where they can attract people for all the reasons that people want to travel. And I think everything that I touched on before with respect to that being easy and fluid and there being no barriers are policy decisions that have to be made. I'm going to skip that one and I'm going to finish with this. And finally, I think we need to stop thinking about remote work as just being about work. Remote work is really, to me, about the future of living. It's potentially a quality of life upgrade for an entire generation who have had very little. And the ability to live and work from anywhere underpins, in many respects, the core tenet that freedom of movement promised. Remote work is about the democratization of access to opportunity. Offices have been great for some people, but terrible for others. And remote work should lead to the most diverse and inclusive companies in history. They should be the best place in the world for single parents to work, or people caring for other family members, or anyone with a health condition or an impairment that makes it difficult to work in an office. And remote work has the potential to be as disruptive as everything that we've lived through over the last 30 years, computers, software, and the internet. And I think with respect to policy, the question we need to ask ourselves is Europe going to act now, or are they going to follow like they have with several other things? And yeah, that's it for me.
Thanks very much, Chris. Much appreciate that. There's no doubt, I think, the point about lifestyle, and that's what it's about creating a whole lifestyle. And I suppose the challenge you put there to people is like whether, well, the idea that it can include all and that everybody can have a fair chance in a different work environment, I think is very, very important. But equally, the challenge you put at a European level for all of us at European level to try and ensure that them possibilities are realised over the next number of years. And I think that's what this is really all about. We're going to come to questions later on, just for those in the audience. We're going to come to questions later on. What we'd ask is if you put the questions into the chat, and we'll manage them from there. So anyone who's any questions, put them in the chat and we'll pick them up and we'll ask the guys once the full panel has gone through. So next up, we've Maeve McElwee from IBEC. the Irish Business Organisation. And basically, Maeve, I think, is going to take it from the perspective of employers and employees. Thank you, Maeve.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to talk to you this afternoon. So as Colm has said, my name is Maeve McElwee. I'm the Director of Employer Relations in IBEC, and IBEC is the largest employers representative group in Ireland. And the area that I have particular responsibility for within the business is looking at that whole area of employment relations, looking at all of the industrial relations, ER representation for our member organisations, and advising them across the whole spectrum of issues around employment rights and legislation and so on. And so for us, this whole area of remote working has been one that we have been tracking for a number of years under our Smarter World, Smarter Work campaign, and really recognising the evolution of remote working, even in the years pre-pandemic. But of course, what we've seen is that huge explosion in remote working as a result of the necessity for people to be working from home for public health grounds. And it's been a great opportunity to learn all of the I suppose, opportunities that remote working can bring to us. As a national organisation ourselves with 5 regional offices around the country, as well as an office in Brussels, I think we're very well aware of the opportunities that remote working brings to our regional locations, and how greater investment in the whole area of remote, hybrid, flexible working can bring and drive those opportunities for real growth, vibrancy and balanced development in our regional areas. In our own most recent CEO survey, similar to what other participants are reflecting back as well, lots of the organisations saying to us at the moment, of those who have remote working in place now, more than or just over 4 out of 5 expect that they will continue forms of hybrid working post-pandemic. Across all of the respondent organisations, 74% saying that they expect to increase the amount of hybrid working over the next 2 to 3 years, with the proportion of employees working fully remotely or fully office-based, I should say, starting to decline in the next 2 to 3 years as well. So a really strong commitment from employers around engaging with remote working and seeing the opportunities that are there. And of course, from that employer perspective, as we've been tracking lots of very strong opportunities for employment, particularly looking at areas like recruitment and retention, accessing a much broader pool of candidates, both nationally and internationally, but also the fact that greater opportunities in remote and hybrid working also really increases the vibrancy of our regional development in our regional cities, by virtue of attracting maybe dual career couples. So advancing the opportunities for people to move and relocate, something that was a considerable barrier to have people relocate into regional areas because of the concern that a partner within the couple wouldn't also be able to find opportunities there. And so remote and hybrid working has really been a great positive in terms of that. It's also been really useful in terms of driving greater integration and diversity in our organisations. So looking at different aspects of that diversity, whether that's being more inclusive around being able to facilitate people with disabilities to offer their labour into the labour market and to work more effectively in a remote environment, or indeed different cultural and caring responsibilities that people may need to attend to and still actually be able to offer a very significant contribution to the labour market that employers are then able to capture and to be able to take on board. So that's fantastic. Also then looking at things like flexibility, and other panelists have already referred to this, but the whole area of flexibility, work-life balance is really important. And when we look at employment legislation as it applies across Europe, more and more statutory legislation coming in, actually the opportunity to have more remote and hybrid working allows us to be able to integrate that flexibility much more within our organizations. So the challenges that employers feel around facilitating work-life balance, statutory leaves, parental leaves is very much ameliorated when you have a much wider pool of talent that you can draw from in a remote and hybrid situation, where you're not always relying on local talent to be able to backfill for people taking leave and taking other opportunities to be out of the workforce over a much longer working life. So very significant opportunities there for employers and employees. And of course, with opportunities always come challenges in the employment relationship, none of which are insurmountable, and many of which have already been touched on. So of course, for employers, one of the big challenges is to ensure that people have adequate broadband and adequate access to digital technology, and that regional connectivity being a really key area of importance. And for employers, we would say that really needs to be underpinned by that fundamental investment in social infrastructure, including housing, schools, hospitals, and roads, to be able to support that connectivity across the board. In terms of facilitating as well, obviously we need to see very considerable investment in training. And for employers, that training is twofold. In the first instance, it's training for managers. And while we've had this great opportunity to learn what remote working can do for us, it would appear that in large part, at least initially, what a lot of employers are looking at is hybrid working. And that's a very new environment for many employers. And while we've managed through an emergency period, we really need to upskill ourselves and bring a very strong expertise around how we manage our remote and hybrid workforces, how we ensure that we manage our diversity, equality, and integration of people across the board and deal with that proactively. And of course, as we move into a new world of technology, it's all of the upskilling that's going to be required to really take all of the opportunity the new technology and digital skills can bring and keep us moving along the line. That same CEO survey that I spoke about earlier also indicates that very significant proportions of organizations at this point are looking at very significant investment in managers to bring that training up to speed, and also similar levels of investment in technology within their organizations in order to be able to facilitate that. I think the last piece I'll touch on from the employer perspective is around the whole area of equality. And so as we move into more remote and hybrid working, really important for us to focus on equalities around gender balance, issues around particularly our demographics and our youth, to ensure that the same opportunities that were afforded to us in organizations where we all came together every day are worked on and made available to newer recruits as they come to our businesses, to learn organizational cultures, to feel fully enfolded, and to have those opportunities to be able to grow their own networks and ensure their own career development. And I think when we talk about social infrastructure, things like housing are going to be really important as we look to secure people's equality of access to remote working, ensuring that they have appropriate accommodation, that they have appropriate security, data protection opportunities, and that they don't then get left out of the opportunity to avail of remote working opportunities as well. So many more areas to touch on, but I'll leave it there and hand it back. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Maeve, as ever enlightening. I'll move next on to Tracy Keogh. Now, Tracy Keogh is one of the co-founders of Grow Remote. Grow Remote has played a big part in helping us organise this event today. And certainly for the last number of years, Grow Remote has done an enormous amount of work. I think they're across 17 countries at this stage, promoting the concept of remote working. So I'll hand you over to Tracy.
And it's funny, Colm, it never gets easier. I'm still nervous getting ready to talk. Thank you, Colm, and thank you to Seamus Bonner, who's on the call, who put in an awful lot of work in getting this event together. My name is Tracy. I'm co-founder of a non-profit called Grow Remote, and we make remote work local. To follow on from Lisa's piece, a while ago, we were ruminating on that idea that for 20 years we've been talking about remote work in rural areas. And we kind of just got a bit frustrated as a bunch of community developers and thought, should we be looking into this or not? Like, we just need access to the right information. And although we were hearing a lot of theoretical talk about remote work, sorry, I need to turn on my timer. We were wondering, how come the companies who talk about remote work are still advertising jobs in city centre locations? Either we can access those opportunities or we can't. And so we set about building this organisation, and we grew on no budget and no resources up until October of this year into 144 local communities in 17 countries. We run 2 training programs, one for people managers, one for those who are unemployed. But fundamentally, we're about neutral access to information about remote work and all about offline and local. What we want to see is systemic change. We want to embed the good behaviours that have happened through COVID and make sure that they're sustainable. And you can kind of break that down into supply and demand. In supply, we have 55,000 remote jobs are open in any community across Europe today. And we're very lucky to have on the call Rachel Craig. Rachel Craig is a prime example of this. She actually found this figure, but she's founder of EU Remote Jobs. And from an island off the coast of Donegal, she wanted to stay there. She couldn't find out where the jobs are, and she built her own solution for it. This is the kind of thing that we want to see more people knowing about. When we say remote jobs, we mean location agnostic employment. And it's important to note the shift in remote work from contracting and gig work into employment. Just yesterday, a superb company called remote.com raised 150 million to help companies employ compliantly in countries across the world. That means that we get access to decent employment with pensions and sick pay and all of the things that people in cities just naturally get. The second stream of supply is increasing the supply of remote work, and that's helping organizations transition from office-based work to remote work, advertising jobs without location. So I want you to imagine going on to Microsoft.com/careers, and there's jobs in Dublin, Chicago, someplace else, and then remote. There's options, and there are options available to us no matter where we live. And we're supporting organizations to do that through an alliance of knowledge sharing on the transition to remote, but also through those training programs. If we look at then demand, I guess there's two things that we need to do to stimulate demand from the areas who need it most. Again, sometimes we talk about remote work as though it's theoretical and far away. There are 55,000 remote jobs open in any community today, and people still do not know about them. They don't know about them because there's no business model to make that information local, to tell our local people about it. And that's, I guess, why we step in. But first of all is making those visible. So we would advertise jobs in these companies free of charge. Remote companies don't have a problem accessing talent, so they don't need to come to us. We need their jobs more than they need us. But they're very eager to work with organizations like us and to support communities in rural and regional areas. And the second one is accessibility. So after you know where the job is, do you have the skills to be able to get it? There's an organization in Ireland who let us know that really we didn't have a remote ready workforce. People didn't know enough about remote work to know whether or not it's for them, and some skills around that I'll go into it shortly. Connecting both supply and demand is local chapters on the ground. They are very, very key. Isolation is the biggest killer of remote work. And so to have sustainable employment in our local communities, these local communities of remote workers are key. So if we take the first strand of supply, the jobs that are already here, this is Hopin. It's Europe's fastest growing startup, noted as Europe's fastest growing startup. And they have jobs across all sectors, admin, sales, all levels of the organization, but they're advertised without location. So really what we need to do is take those jobs and bring them into our local communities. Interestingly enough, Ireland is one of the fastest growing bases for Hopin. So when they advertise a job without location, they're finding the talent in Ireland. Supply 2, I suppose, is helping companies on the transition to remote. I know I'm flying through this, but so when we talk about hybrid work, I think there's a lot of confusion around that. What we're seeing from staff surveys is a third fully in the office, don't talk to people about remote, a third in and out, and a third fully remote. And what needs to underpin that is remote first culture. It's the cultural shift that is going to take the longest, that is the key to unlocking remote work done well and hybrid done well. Fundamentally, it's about choice. Policy, technology, and culture have to shift. COVID has drove on technology. Policy is doable. Culture is years of work. It's definitely doable. Like May said, it's not insurmountable, but we really need to place a focus on it. In demand, if we look at, so Lisa touched on attracting people back to rural areas. That's one way, but what we focus on currently is getting people in their local communities employed. Often when we talk about remote work, we talk about bringing people back from cities. There's plenty of talent where I am here in the Burn. They just didn't have access to opportunity. So how do we help those? Workplaceless are a brilliant international certification in remote work as a skill, and they have a competency model that covers a range of things. But what we hear from our employer partners, who are some of the largest remote companies in the world, is knowing enough about remote work, written communication for good documentation, self and time management, and that was mentioned in the questions by an attendee there. There is more of an onus on the employee in this instance, and knowledge of the tools around remote work. As I said, we need somebody to connect the dots locally. Recruiters don't step in. These companies don't come to careers days in schools. They're not advertising the same job boards that we're used to. So what we do in Grow Remote is bring all the information together with thanks to our funders above here, put it in one place, educate one local lead, and they in turn educate their local communities. And these are volunteers all across the world who are doing superb work in activating their local communities. So to bring it all in, what's possible, right? So we know that something needs to change at EU level. And we know that there is a huge opportunity at EU level. Again, the jobs are already here. If we never increase the supply, if we never do anything else, there are companies who are making remote work works now. So why aren't the jobs getting to the communities who need them most? I think Emer Curry is on the call, a fantastic senator in Ireland, and she was the person who gave us the idea for a Brexit ready campaign, but for remote work. And I think that's exactly what we need. We need to build up awareness of these jobs and about how you transition to remote work. Everybody has mentioned case studies. We need them quick, and they should be actually quite a quick win that we will be able to do. The second is supply. So if we want to increase the supply of remote jobs across Europe, we need to fund cultural transformation projects. And we need to see outputs of case studies and blueprints and playbooks coming out of that to help other organizations do it. Can we set a target? Can jobs in the Commission be advertised without location in Europe? Can I get a job anywhere from the burn here? And I suppose other ways, just using the system that's there, right? Can we educate current job programs that are in place about all of these other opportunities? Because honestly, sometimes when you tell people about companies like GitLab, they are shocked. They never knew that they could work in companies like this. But fundamentally, to underpin all of those, we need to lock in the supply of remote work. So this idea that remote work used to be for the top 7%, where you'd spend 15 years in Dublin or some other city, eventually your manager would trust you. Then they'd be like, okay, if you want to move home, you can, but you're kind of getting a one-off secret deal. That needs to end because you're coming down with a salary that we can't obtain in our communities. It's unbalanced, it's unfair. So we need to lock it in so that companies are comfortable advertising without location. And then we need to build new distribution models to ensure the work gets to the places who need it most. Huge thank you to Colm Markey and the team behind it. This is the first session between community, industry and policymakers, and I think it's wildly exciting, and I think it's probably only the start, but just Colm, thanks to you and the team behind you for being a pleasure to work with.
Thanks very much, Tracy, and certainly you can give me some thanks, but the whole team behind, as you well know, put enough of work into this over the last week or two, or last nearly a month at this stage, between pursuing various things, including getting the commissioner on board and various things like that. So they all deserve a massive thank you, as do all the panelists here today who've made wonderful contributions. We'll move along to the questions now. There's a number of them coming in, and I suppose one that's come in, that's actually coming in a text message to me. Everybody, I think, here has mentioned equality and the equality of jobs. And the question there is, as Tracy touched on it there at the end, that a lot of the jobs that are remotely available are upper end jobs, or are jobs basically IT-based jobs. This person is wondering, in terms of equality of opportunity, are the jobs for people with a lower skill that aren't, let's say, just a techie type job? And I suppose there's a question to the panelists who want to start.
I want to Grow Remote.ie on our blog section. We have 5 companies who specifically ask for people who have not come from the tech sector. Shopify, one of the largest all remote companies in the world, are hiring 4,000 remote workers. You'll start there on 29,000. They look for a good attitude. If you've had experience in hospitality, retail, you know how to talk to people. You can deal with pretty challenging situations. Perfect. You can work on Shopify. So yes.
Chris, any thoughts from your end?
Yeah, I just echo that. I think we work with a lot of clients that have people that are audio transcriptionists or scribes for medical companies or tele workers for call centers. And yeah, I think this isn't something that's predominantly held to tech. I think tech's the obvious solution for, the route into some of these jobs, but actually a lot of the jobs that are remote aren't tech jobs.
Okay, Maeve, have you any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd agree, absolutely. I don't think it's necessarily just tech jobs. I mean, everything across sales, HR, there's all kinds of opportunities at every level. And I wouldn't in any way think actually that would be defined by whether it's a tech job or not. I think there's plenty of opportunity at all levels.
Hey, Lisa.
Yeah, I agree. And I think it's also, the big issue is also the change of mind from the employer's point of view. And as Tracy said, you know, before COVID, it was kind of like, oh, you get this odd person who has this arrangement that they can work from home, but now it's become a lot more acceptable. And I hope that keeps going on, and that will then spread to all branches. I hope.
Yes, yeah. I have a question here from Damien Boylan in relation to the whole tax situation with people working in one location and employed in another. I don't know if maybe Maeve, I don't know if you have any opinion on that, or maybe Chris, I don't know if you've come across in the past, what the situation as regards tax or that scenario. Maybe it's quite technical one. I don't know. Maeve, I'll go to you first, Anna.
Yeah, and I won't claim to be an expert in tax or regulation across different jurisdictions, but it is undoubtedly a challenge, and it's something that we've seen in this period of the pandemic, where lots of employers have facilitated members of their teams to work remotely and maybe work remotely from home countries. And the longer people are abroad, the more challenging that has become, where you have different tax jurisdictions and issues arising out of it. So certainly it's an issue. It's a piece of administration that employers and employees need to be very aware of when they're starting to look at working across different jurisdictions. But again, in a lot of circumstances, it won't necessarily be the key issue that's going to mitigate against the opportunity. But there is there are requirements around having the substance of your operations as well in countries where you're paying your corporation tax. So that needs to be an important consideration too for lots of organizations.
Okay, I've one here from Mary Reardon about internet connectivity is important, but it's not the only issue. In mobile phone coverage, childcare, public transport. That's a lot, I suppose, of what you are talking about, Chris, in terms, and indeed Lisa, you as well, that it's about the overall package and the quality of life. I don't know if you want to come back in and just reinforce that point, maybe in terms of that, Chris.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. There's nothing difficult about a lot of those things, but obviously it's about access. And I think internet's one part, mobile connectivity is the other. I think childcare is the big thing that we hear from probably the widest array of people. And I think the important part here is to acknowledge that what people have experienced over the last 15 months has been pandemic remote work. This is not normal remote work. During normal times, you're not homeschooling your kids. There aren't lockdowns. You can't not travel. You can still see your friends, and you can eat out at restaurants, and you can work at coffee shops. So yeah, I think there's a danger that we start to think remote work isn't what it is because of the experience millions of people have had that have never seen normal remote work. But I think in normal times, many of those things are less problematic, so to speak.
In many ways, it's about the other ways you'd attract people to work or to live in your area are just as relevant for attracting them to work in the area. I think it's the same set of criteria. I don't know, Lisa, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, I agree on that. And that has, of course, for the islands, it's also connectivity through ferry services. That is very important because even if you have remote work, of course, you're not bound to be on the island forever. So you want to be able to get across every now and then. And it's of course, it's childcare, education, health services, everything to make up the good life that will attract people. And I think there's also an issue on green transition, because at the very remote areas and islands, everything is more expensive. It's more expensive to make the green transition, not only for the ferries, but also for energy production, or if you want to energy renovate your house, everything is more expensive. And I think this should be addressed possibly at an EU level, how to make sure that the very remote areas are also on board in the green transition, because people want to live green. It's a very big issue for everybody today, of course.
Okay, I'll move on to the next one because we've plenty of questions here, so we'll try and get around everyone. Jerry O'Connor has asked a question about remote hubs. He points out the environmental gain, I suppose, of people not having to commute to work and all that. But he's wondering, like, do remote hubs and enterprise centres have a key part to play in this, or what's people's perspective as regards that part of the equation? I'll go to Tracy, you first on this.
Well, we started off trying to fill hubs because the next thing people did after wondering how I've been talking about this for 20 years is start to build hubs. And we just released in Ireland a Connected Hubs project that has, well, WDC and NASEC and the government did all the hubs together in one place. Not every remote job can work from a hub. So Shopify, eBay, and other companies don't actually allow you to work from a hub. And then there are other organizations who will offer you co-working stipends. On our blog, we've listed all of those and how to find them yourself. So companies will pay the hub directly or pay you to work from a hub. So it's not always suitable, and it's important that we separate out the two. We know that where there's a community of remote workers that encompasses hybrid workers who work between home and the headquarters, people who just work from home, and people who work from the hub, if they're meeting regularly in their own right, it can increase the occupancy rates in hubs of between 20 to 80%. So having that kind of community locally is very important, and that's what's happening in 144 local communities. But the thing that we need to see to systemize the change is Irish companies and EU companies putting in co-working stipends as part of their everyday model. So you get a stipend to have a home office, but you also get a stipend to work from a co-working space. And there is no Irish company that has that in place today.
Okay, Chris, do you want to make a comment on it? You that supplies the equipment is put into these places?
Yeah. I think that's a key part that I think many people just completely misunderestimate, or they don't think. So they've got back pain and neck pain and repetitive strain injuries. So companies really trying to make workers as safe, comfortable, and productive at home as they would be in an office. In some ways is a prerequisite of them doing good work. And I think companies will get there. It's obviously been difficult circumstances, but having the right tools are sort of table stakes for doing.
Okay, I think you're breaking up a bit there. I'll go to Lisa just on this.
Yeah, well, I agree. It's important to make sure that you have a good workspace at home, but also these local places for like a common, you can work together in a local office space, and to enforce that and ensure that, I think it's important.
Maeve, any thoughts? No?
I think hubs provide lots of really good opportunity for people to work in a safe and secure environment, and also equality opportunities for people to be able to access remote working. So for instance, where perhaps somebody has a partner caring for children or an elderly parent at home, the house may not be suitable. Home environments maybe for younger persons who are sharing smaller apartments, for instance, may not be suitable accommodation for remote working at home, but remote hubs then allow people a greater opportunity, maybe not to be commuting as far, but also to have that appropriate workspace and safe workspace. Because Chris, in terms of what he was saying, is correct. Employers have a responsibility, and that health and safety obligation doesn't just extend to the office environment, it's at your place of work. And if that's a remote place of work, it's really important that employers are aware of those obligations under the health and safety regulation. And just one other piece, and Chris touched on this, the ability to work anywhere. For employers, I suppose this is a really huge consideration, because actually it's not really the ability to be able to work anywhere. Working in places like coffee shops and public networks is a really challenging issue for employers because of issues of data protection, data security, cyber security. So one of the key issues, and hubs can help to provide this in areas where connectivity is poor, is those secure environments where people can work, and that the employer and the person working has adequate control over the security of the network and the information sharing connectivity that's required.
Okay, there's really too many questions to get through, but I've won an interesting one here from Pat Bogue that says about people who are, be it blended working or remote working, will there be less visible in the workforce, and will that in some way impact on their let's say the promotion potential? Is that an issue, or how should I, maybe I'll come to you first on that one, maybe, because it's very much an employer thing. If somebody's working from home and they're not part of in the middle of the dynamic of the office, are they going to lose out?
it's a really key concern. And I do think it's something that we need to be hugely aware of, because this is a new way of working. And for lots of managers within our organizations, it'll be a completely new experience in terms of how we learn to manage people. And I think that's the point around the investment in training. It's going to be really important that we understand how people are connected in, that people don't get forgotten, because of course that potential is there, and that we're watching all of that inclusivity and diversity issues. And I think for employers, you know, lots of questions already starting to come up around even the dynamic of who may apply for remote working. You know, we hear about people talking about childcare responsibilities. You know, what happens when it's largely or predominantly your female workforce looking for that remote working opportunity? Where is the obligation on employers maybe to try and balance that and ensure that there's an appropriate balance of childcare responsibility, appropriate levels of people working remotely, and that share of remote working? So I think we have a lot to learn. And I think we're going to have to learn to do it very, very quickly so that we do avoid any of those issues becoming problematic for us into the coming years.
It's interesting, this question, not only Pat Bogue, the same question has come all the way from Mexico, so it's good to see. But moving along, Chris, have you a thought on that?
Yeah, I think Maeve has far better thoughts on this than me, but I sort of just echo everything that she's saying. There's obviously potential issues with respect to people getting promoted. I think leaders typically ask about younger people. How are they going to learn through osmosis and all these things? And I think the reality is, when you look at younger workforces, many of them have grown up with the technology to learn online and build relationships. And I think in certain respects, this can be a generational thing as well, where access and understanding of how to use technology is somewhat understood by certain generations, less so by others. And I think the final point made around women, obviously I'm not the right person to speak to this, but some of the data that came out around women falling out of the workforce during the pandemic because they are primary caregivers is an issue. So yeah, hopefully it resolves that, but I think we need to be very purposeful about what we're doing.
And on that question, to all the panel, like for minority groups, for women, for people, let's say, who mothers who maybe, or just parents will say, who have young children, is it an advantage? I'd imagine surely it's an advantage for all those groups to have the chance to work remotely. It may give them the chance to get a job that they wouldn't have got otherwise. Lisa, you that's in a kind of a rural location and it can be disadvantaged in certain ways. What's your sense of that? Is it?
I think also the very small communities as islands, they also provide a very safe community where everybody knows each other and can take care of each other, maybe in a different way than in a high rise in the city. So I think in that way you could actually include vulnerable people more in a way.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And then if they can then work from there, it will be an advantage.
A question that's coming in here from Sean McKiernan is, will the cities lose out? Well, if people move out remotely, is that going to change the dynamic in our city centres, or will it maybe lead to a different type of dynamic in our city centres? I don't know. Maeve or Chris or Tracy, have you any thoughts on that?
I'll jump in first, if I can. I think it will change depending on the scale of how we move to remote and hybrid. It could change the dynamic within our cities. It'll be really important to make sure that we don't lose that vibrancy, because actually in many ways we know that one of the things that attracts people, tourists and so on, is not just our beautiful rural areas, but also that whole city experience. And that can make for a very attractive labour market and work location. So I think important that we find the right balance and understand that actually work in cities drives a whole lot of other business within cities, drives a whole lot of our experience economy, and is very important for that experience economy and for the experience of actually living within a city and having that cultural experience. So it's important to think that we balance the best of both. I think it might also give lots of domestic companies opportunities to be able to operate within city centres that have largely found themselves maybe crowded out by larger businesses, and maybe allow some of our smaller domestic businesses access to city centre locations too.
Okay, Tracy, do you want to make a comment?
I'm a Dub. I love to pull that out when people say, you know, we're all about rural Ireland. I was born and bred a Dub until I was 6 years of age. I had the Jackie accent and everything. It always reminds me of, you know, when they want to take out car parks out of the middle of a business area, and people are like, no, we need to leave them in, and then they take them out as a test and business goes up and everybody's like, wow, this is amazing. I can imagine for myself, cities that are not packed with traffic, where you have pedestrianised streets, where kids are playing on them, where it's just a more vibrant place, that tourists really want to come to. And when they come, they won't be sitting in traffic, and they'll be able to experience our culture in so many different ways. I think it's hugely exciting for cities. And I think if you unlock jobs from a location and people leave, you have a much bigger problem than remote work. You have a problem that we should have been fixing anyway.
I think you're right it's about changing the dynamic and the culture of a city. That if you free up the congestion in a city, it's like making a pedestrian area in a city. It's the same type of concept. It will free up and it'll make it more accommodating. Maybe looking from the outside, Lisa, have you any thoughts on whether it'll help, or maybe you have no care for the cities? I don't know.
No, I do, and I think it's very important not to be either rural or city. You know, it's for everybody. And I think it's true that with less congestion, the cities will be much more attractive, actually, also for islanders or people in rural areas. And I think it's also very important to state that if you live in a rural area or on an island, it's not a life sentence. Like, you can move to a city or the opposite. You know, I think it's important that we think of it as a vibrant community, both in the cities and in the rural areas, and that we can all visit or, you know, move within your lifetime back and forth. And I think that's very important. And that would then be also much more attractive if the city wasn't full of traffic and stressed people. So I think
it's one thing, I suppose. People talk a lot about the housing side of it, and there's a number of questions that come in on the housing side. But interestingly, like, I suppose if people move out of the cities, it may take the pressure off the housing in the cities to some degree. But two of the questions that come in, one from Billy Timmins in Wicklow and one from Culla Rantala in Inishbuffin, about the idea of housing in rural areas. The policy is driving people to housing in urban areas. The like of one-off houses are not maybe a policy doesn't drive people towards that. So certainly the housing issue is just not a rural one, an urban one. And I think maybe on that score, there's an important one. I don't know if anyone has any thoughts on, like, I think Chris has touched on it earlier, the whole idea of creating the overall experience. And I think that's definitely very important. I don't know if anyone has any comments on that.
Yeah, well, I'll comment on that, because housing it's a very new problem to the islands, as I said, and I think it's important to remember it's actually a positive problem. It means that people want to come, people want to live there, and 100 years ago you lived maybe 8 or 12 people in a house where people now live 2 people. So of course it's also a change of lifestyle that's playing in here. But I think it's important to support public housing, for example. And in Denmark, there's the Ministry of Internal Affairs and Housing has actually set aside a fund starting this January that will help build public houses on islands. So they will fund like 1/3 of it or something. This, of course, you still need the building company and the municipality to join in and want to do this, but it's a start. And I think it will be interesting to see, will this actually work? Is it just the money that's lacking, or are there other issues? And of course, all over Europe, it's different regulation. In Denmark, there's very strict rules about what you can actually build within 100 and 300 meters from the coast and 3 kilometers. So there's actually coastal rules that also prevent building houses. But it's also, I think, a matter of being able to use old farming houses, for example, or farm stables or something that is not used anymore in the land or in the agricultural business, but are just empty. If you can transform them to housing or to apartments or something like that, that would also be quite attractive, I think. But it needs help. Yeah.
Sorry, thanks, Lisa. Chris, has any of the people you've dealt with, have they mentioned housing in the rural context has been an issue, or have you come across that much?
No, not really. I think most of the companies we're talking to are typically less focused on the, I guess, living situations of the individual. And I think they see it as almost too big brothery to have much saying in that. I think certainly what they are focused on is not just hiring people in specific locations, and the implication of that is people can live anywhere, and whether that is more rurally or in cities, which we've obviously been speaking about. But in terms of going into the specific types of accommodation that people are living in, not so much.
Okay, very interesting one here is probably a common theme from Sinead Doody. It's in relation to people, the isolation and the impact. Will people become hermits in the long run through the isolation? And I suppose it is a very important question for how you create the culture of remote work. And maybe I'll come to you maybe Maeve first on this, about that culture of including people, that they don't become isolated.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And again, speaking from my own experience, I worked remotely full-time for 5 years, a number of years ago. And even though I would have been out with our member organizations on a regular basis, after a while, I did find it very difficult not to have that day-to-day contact with colleagues. And I chose to go back to the office. And I know that lots of people, rely on work as more than just the work, that it's a really important social engagement structure. And in technology times, and particularly for younger generations who are very used to communications via digital means, those opportunities to come together, to see people face to face, to make small talk, to learn a little bit about them. We haven't yet really developed a lot of skills. And I think the pandemic has taught us that. We're inclined to go Zoom meeting to Zoom meeting, and a lot of the chit chat and the daily engagement that we have in office environments, we haven't quite learned yet how to do that very well in a remote environment. And that is going to be important, I think, for building our organizational cultures, for making sure that we have that level of inclusion, and that we're kind of alive to issues that people might be having in the workplace. Much easier to understand if somebody is having a problem, having a difficult day, or maybe something more serious when you see them face to face and you've got a little bit of time with them. And that's really important for how we mind people and mental health and well-being in the workplace. So I think definitely a lot of learning around that.
Perfect. Tracy, any thoughts?
Yeah, there's two types of isolation. First of all, is within the organization, and we train up kind of organizations like AXA, AIG, Aer Lingus, those organizations. And one trend that's happening now, like it used to be the head of remote role, is building internal communities of practice for remote workers, places where people can go to congregate. So in the likes of Shopify, they meet twice per year, once in the winter, once in the summer, for like team retreats, but they also are meeting like every month. Because they're fully distributed, people are starting to congregate actually quite locally. And some companies have stipends for you to go visit your colleagues around the world, which is very exciting and good for relationship building. But I think everything that Maeve mentioned there kind of signifies the big cultural shift that needs to happen to become an organization that's inclusive of people no matter where they are. There are tools that are coming out like Kona, where you can kind of signify how you're feeling that day. So because you can't see somebody and they're looking a bit, you won't talk to them about something challenging. But if you don't know about that, you might call them up, and that might. So there's tools and there's processes coming out to help that, but really it's a cultural and behavioural shift that needs to happen. The second form of isolation is in your local community. So the story that I tell is in Castlebar, we've got the largest community of local remote workers, and a guy came, Mike Griffin from GitLab, and he had 200 cards. And he said, I've had nobody to give these to for 3 years, because every event has been for freelancers and self-employed, and there's been nothing for me. So in Grow Remote, not to pitch us all the time, but we're a non-profit, everything's free. So not that there's no charging. We local volunteers are kind of building that community specifically for remote workers in their local community. And we're kind of trying to quantify the time that's going back into the community because of that. But they're doing things like going for pints, going for Couch to 5K, hosting talks, growing vegetables together, a range of things. And really, the last point I'll make on that is the chairperson of our organization is John Reardon. He's a chairperson of Shopify, who are hiring 4,000 remote workers this year. And the reason that he's our chairperson, one of the reasons, is that for him to be able to retain remote staff in Ireland, and they hire 400 people without location in Ireland, all work from home, he needs them to be in an environment where they're going to stay, where they're not feeling isolated in their local community. And so building that softer side of the ecosystem in Ireland is really critical to him retaining his staff in Shopify. So it's important for everybody. And if you want a free kit to build a local community, it's on our website.
Lisa, any thoughts?
No, I agree. It's probably not as much the feeling isolated within a small community, because it's sometimes easier to actually be part of the local community and play a role and start, you know, doing this and that with the others. But I do agree that it can be a problem within the organization if you remote work. But that's where I think it's very, very important that we right now start sharing the good examples from people who have, or organizations who have actually cracked the nut or are starting to see this and this would be a good idea, like Tracy was saying. So I think that's something we need to share right now.
Okay, and just one from, I suppose, a little bit of my own experience as well, and I see it here in a couple of the questions. The idea of, like, well, just to give us an example from our own situation, there's 4 of us, or 5 of us in total, including myself, around my office, if you like, and we're spread from Ireland to Brussels. And during the lockdown, it was hard to keep communication. Like the idea of even the coffee break and things like that. So how you create the little dynamic that goes on in an office, how do you create that remotely? How do you, like the water, what do you call it, the water fountain, or what do you call it, moment, or the coffee break, them sort of things where you just have a general interaction, you lose that. Is there a way you can recreate that in a virtual way? Go to Chris first, might be something that he's come across with all people he's met.
Yeah, I think my response to that would be we shouldn't replicate the office remotely. I think actually leveraging the benefits of remote to maximize the effects on the organization is huge. And yeah, I hear a lot of those things from companies around like water cooler, we solve all our problems there. And to me, the question is, if we solve all our problems at the water cooler by mistake, we probably don't have much of a business. And I think there's a lot of like office dogma around some of these things where, yeah, there's certain elements of truth to some of the things, but actually I think when you start to distill it down, there's a lot of intangible things that people don't really understand. People talk about communication and collaboration being difficult remotely. I don't know if it's difficult as much as it's different. So I think it's just about embracing the different and understanding that actually things just aren't the same, and that's okay. And we need to maximize that for obviously the benefit of the business if we can.
Okay. Does anyone else want to come in on that one?
Can I come in on a column?
Tracy,
before
sure.
I was full-time in Grow Remote, I was in Bank of Ireland, and we were working on a project embedding remote work across the group. And I brought in an expert on remote work for years, like proper remote work into it. And I wanted him to give them advice. And this question comes up all of the time. And he said, right, you're going to have to get uncomfortable and you're going to have to be vulnerable. And he said that to a bunch of managers in a bank. And I was like, I was looking for like measurable things that we could track. And I was like, I have to track vulnerability. How do you do that? Everything needs to be more intentional and deliberate. What are the kind of conversations that you want to have? Like, we found very subtle things, like people will walk up to your desk and interrupt you, no problem, but they won't pick up phone and just have a quick chat with you, particularly if you're senior. So how can you use tools like Hopin or other tools to be able to drive those sporadic meetings between people where you don't feel like, God, I'm going to take the call now from the director of whatever, I'm getting a bit nervous. You just bump into them and you chat to them like you would in the canteen. There are ways around it, but it takes a different style of leadership, which is why, as May said, training is really important. And it takes a deliberate and intentional approach to the culture that you're trying to build in the organization.
Okay, are we done on that one? I was lost track there for a second. I don't know if anyone else wants to make any further comment on that. One that's here in front of me that came in as well on the chat around different jurisdictions saying different wages and different costs of living. Like, I suppose certain parts of the world are easier to live in, or more economical to live in, and yet will they get the fair wages, or how's that going to balance out? Maybe you're the one with the employer's perspective. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or, well, I suppose just before you come in, one of the key questions in relation to that issue, like if we are a higher cost economy in this part of the world, are we going to lose the jobs to the lower cost economy?
I think, no matter what way you're working, whether it's remote or on site, if we're uncompetitive that's always going to be a risk that we lose to lower cost economies. So I think really, however we're working, the really critical piece is that we're working in a competitive, sustainably competitive way into the long term. I think when it comes to remote work and where people are located, it's certainly challenging in terms of aligning salary and determining what that's going to look like. We do know that with lots of our global organizations where people are working maybe for one jurisdiction but working in another, that they tend to work at the local rate because that's the economy in which they're based, that's the living cost that they're facing. They're not necessarily carrying the salary that they might expect to attract in a much higher cost environment, for instance. So it's a challenge. Different organizations will approach it differently. And I think it's certainly something that a lot of companies are going to need to think about in terms of their overall performance management systems and reward and recognition systems into the longer term.
Any nervousness in that way in the people you're talking to, Chris, or do you see that as an opportunity?
Yeah, I think it's an opportunity. I speak to companies that are hiring engineers all around the world, and I think that the disconnect that people think there is between wages in high priced economies and what they perceive to be lower cost economies might be closer than they think it is. Every day I speak to companies that are paying the equivalent of Silicon Valley salaries to engineers in India or Nigeria or anywhere else. So I think the reality is maybe the cost of living inside high cost of living expensive cities reduces. So New York and London and salaries sort of go down a little bit there. But I think the reality is there's a lot of other cities in the UK, across Europe, in the US, where salaries haven't increased over the last 20 years or so. And I think with jobs decentralizing to those places, the average salaries, even inside countries that we're talking about that think jobs potentially leave their borders, it does more to increase the average wage of other places.
Lisa, I suppose you're probably on the cheaper end of the cost of living, and well, in Wales anyway. Have you any thoughts on that?
Not really, no, but my only thought on it is that I think it's very important that it's made easy for both the employer and the employee to see through all these different jurisdictions and regulations and tax issues and all that, so that it's actually seems more available for both parts to have remote work. But yeah.
I have another question coming in here. It's pointed towards you, Tracy, from Aidan Campbell. It's hard to identify jobs as it is anywhere, and he wants to know where the current jobs are being advertised, the remote jobs, and I suppose examples of those sort of jobs as well. What's out there that you've seen in terms of? So now's the time to promo for various let's say sites and such, and indeed but it is important to give a flavour of the sort of jobs that have been advertised.
Well, it's actions. Like we're around lots of stuff, but like, where are the jobs? That's kind of what we started with, and that call to action is really important. So interestingly enough, we had a conversation with a company during the week, and they said that they finally got approval to hire for particular roles in England or Ireland without location actually, and it was a financial institution. And they said, oh, we couldn't hire anybody. The pool must be tired out or whatever. And when they looked, they actually were still advertising their jobs in Dublin. They weren't advertising them without location, and that's just naturally limited their talent pool. And what the recruiter on their team said to them is that LinkedIn doesn't allow you to advertise remotely, which it didn't actually until COVID, and now it does. When we were hiring our general manager, we had to advertise it in a city, but now you're able to advertise remotely. And so now traditional job boards like LinkedIn is sources where you can find remote work. There's three big ones. We Work Remotely, the largest remote jobs board in the world. EU Remote Jobs, set up by Donegal lady. And we've got a jobs board, jobs.growremote.ie, which is open source, built by the community. Grow Remote is kind of like a citizen's advice for remote work. So we have all the information around all the jobs boards on our website, and that's there. Just to go back to the point, companies like GitLab are all remote. Everything from their admin to their interns to their senior executives are hired without location. So don't select yourself out of a process. We have a jobs club every month that brings in some of the world's largest remote employers to meet you directly, all of that kind of stuff. There's jobs. Oh yeah, sorry, one more thing. We found a lady who is 64 in rural Laois, her first remote job a month ago. And that story is just there to kind of throw away any connotations or myths you might have about remote work. If she can do it, if Mary can do it, you can get whatever job you want remotely.
Okay, I could continue with all endless questions here. There really is an enormous number of them. We're basically out of time. So what I would do is I'll actually go around to all 4 speakers again in a quick one, if you like. In 3 sentences, I suppose, taking it back to the European level, what should Europe's priorities be in terms of the long-term vision of rural areas, in terms of the conference on the future of Europe, in terms of promoting the, let's say, remote working? And I suppose in particular, the focus has been on rural remote working. Any particular standouts, even 1 or 2 points from each of you? I'll probably start where we started originally. Lisa, have you any thoughts? Just what's your take home for people, or what's your take home for the Commission and the Parliament?
Well, I think it's very important to fast track the infrastructure dependencies. Of the broadband needs to be sent out to the very last house at the end of the road as well, and housing, public transport, all the other basic services need to be covered. And then, as I said, I think it's important to properly resource the voluntary sector, the communities. It should not be overlooked, the importance of the voluntary work done in local communities. And then, as everybody else has said as well, raise the awareness, show the way, show the good cases, and spread the word of how remote work can actually be launched.
Chris, what's your take home, or what's your message to the Commission or the Parliament indeed?
Yeah, I think for me, it's about how can we take advantage of the opportunities that have presented themselves. This is a generational opportunity to take advantage of a catalyst, which has obviously been incredibly difficult for everyone. So now that we know remote work works, now that we know we can trust people to do great work remotely, now that we know remote workers can work from almost anywhere and do incredible work, why will we stand in our way? And I think the bigger question is, how can we get out their way in terms of creating policy, and how can we enable organizations to do it more efficiently? And if we do that, I think there'll be a lot of remote jobs in Europe. And if we don't, they'll go elsewhere.
I think that's a fair point. It's a much more fluid market, and if we don't create the overall experience for people and the overall opportunity, be it in the work side of it, but equally in terms of the lifestyle choices, then we may lose the jobs to elsewhere. Maeve.
I'd have to echo what Lisa said. I think that the connectivity and the infrastructure, both the digital connectivity, the broadband, the technology, but also the housing and the roads infrastructure that allows us to be able to move around and take advantage of that. I think we have to have that longer term investment in training, new ways of working, new ways of communications, lots of work around organizational culture. And I would say this, wouldn't I, in my role of employer relations, but I do think we need to take our time around some of the legislation and regulation around the labour market at the moment too, and not in any way to suggest that regulation isn't good. It is, and really important for a fair and balanced work life. But at the same time, our world is changing very, very quickly. And I think it's really important that we don't end up with regulation around flexible work that makes it more constrained in terms of employers' ability to be able to help people to flex, so that we work carefully and work cohesively around all of the different aspects of remote working, so that we end up with a really sensible and flexible legislative framework.
It's about culture and training and about the legislation. I suppose just on the legislation, just to finish before we leave you, is there anything, let's say you said take our time, is there anything urgently pressing that needs to be addressed given the changing dynamic? And you said yourself it's changing fast. Or can things be taken in a progressive step-by-step approach?
I think specifically where we start looking around things like right to disconnect. So here in Ireland, we've had a really strong engagement, but we've introduced a code of practice rather than very restrictive legislation. that's going to be really important to how people work remotely, that people have a good understanding of how their obligations are going to be. When we look at things like our health and safety legislation, some of that is quite restrictive. It's going to be very expensive for employers to be able to comply with that, to be able to manage it. And again, even things like our equality legislation, our data protection legislation, is going to be really important that we think of all of these things. And we're going to have to iterate how hybrid and remote working work for organizations over the next number of years. So I think we need the proposed legislation around right to request remote working to recognize that, as organizations change, opportunities for people are going to change to both remote work, but also maybe to have to be in the office to supervise, to train, bearing in mind that it's really only about a third of our labour market that can actually work remotely. Lots of other people have to go to work, need to be on site, and that won't change. And there will be times when we need to flex around that, and people who work remotely and in hybrid organisations will need to flex. And our legislation will need to recognise and allow employers some flexibility to be able to deal with those situations.
Tracy, take home from you.
We grew into 144 local communities in 17 countries on no budget, no full-time resources, because people in our rural and regional communities are dying for a little bit of economic empowerment to be able to do something to help our communities. The vacancy rates on our main streets in Ireland pre-COVID were increasing in 17 counties. To see that in a place that you're from is really hard. To have no control over it, to not be able to take any action is even harder. Although housing, broadband, water, everything, obviously very important, and we need to work on them, we cannot wait for it. There are 55,000 remote jobs open in any community in Ireland, and our key message is that we need an awareness campaign that finishes it off, where we eradicate the phrase, there are no jobs here. There are jobs in every single community across Europe, and if we do not work to take them, we're going to lose them. So we need to get a little bit competitive as well. We need a little bit of an edge, but fundamentally, we need to have a kind of a two-tier conversation. One where we're looking at the long-term stuff that needs to change, that is outside of our control, where we need to lobby, where we need to push, where we need to agitate. But we can do work now, and I think active citizenship. It is the first time, Colm, when I finish on this. Usually, decent employment had to be created by government agencies in Ireland, like Enterprise Ireland, Leo, IDA. This is the first time that an average person in their community can create a job in their local community, and that is hugely transformative and meaningful for anybody who does it. So an awareness campaign, please.
Absolutely. Well, sure, look, we started here today with, to be fair, we've had a great engagement from all the panel. I'd like to thank the panel, all four panelists, and indeed the Commissioner, for a very engaging conversation. I'd also like to thank all the attendees. There was well over 100 there. And like the strength of the conversation, I think, is the fact that they're still essentially, I think it was 97 I looked at there a second ago, still engaged. So people didn't drop off because they were truly engaged with what people had to say. I'd also like to thank the own team of Kevin, Paddy, Ian and Ailva. Also, Tracy mentioned earlier Seamus Bonner, who's from Inishmore, who was a massive part of all this as well. He was, in fairness, he contacted Lisa to get involved as well. So I'd like to thank all those in the background. But just before we finish, I think, look, time's up, but I think there's a couple of quick things I just want to say. To my mind, I've lived in rural Ireland, and like most other people here in a rural context, and I've watched for generations people move away. And for the first time, we have a situation here that can reverse that trend. We can also reverse the trend of people being stuck in traffic forever, like 2 hours or 3 hours a day. Remote working gives those opportunities, but we need to put the right infrastructure, the right opportunity in place. We need to create the right culture, and we need to create the right broader environment. I think that's what has been said here today, and they're the things we have to capture. From my perspective, just to let people know, there's an own initiative report being done by the Parliament in relation to the long-term vision of the rural areas, which I intend to play a significant part in. We've also looked to put forward our own initiative report around remote working to identify the issues and feed them in. We'll do a report from what was said here today, and it's going into the Commission as well. So if anyone has any other points that they wish to raise, and we'll certainly pick up the ones that were on the chat, feed them in. And I think this is, as Tracy said, there's an awareness thing here, and there's also obviously the legislative piece and all that in the background. But we want to start a conversation, and today is the first day of a conversation about how we can begin to get the awareness out and to identify the key issues that have to change. And hopefully we can start, if you like, on one level with that awareness, but equally through the structures here in Brussels and through the various ways in which we can engage with the statutory bodies to begin to get the steps that will be taken to put the legislation and the various supports in place to make this happen. So I'd ask people, we'll send a communication out to everyone that registered, and we'd ask them if they have any further points they want to make, feel free to get in touch with us. And also watch this space. We'll be back with more in terms of trying to promote the 55,000 jobs, promote the lifestyle choice, and promote the opportunity that could regenerate, particularly our rural communities. So look, folks, we leave it at that. I'd like to thank everyone for being here and look forward to engaging with you again soon. Thank you.
Carlingford is situated in a beautiful spot on the east coast of Ireland between two capital cities, Dublin and Belfast. Carlingford Remote Working Hub, managed by Carlingford Heritage, is housed in an old Victorian railway station. However, the hub itself just opened its doors in June 21. So inside, it's totally modern with high-speed broadband and ergonomic furniture. It's also equipped with a private call booth, coffee station, and then there's the view. And it wouldn't have been possible without Louth Leader Partnership funding. So thank you. For that work-life balance, the hub lies in the heart of Carlingford, close to cafes, restaurants and shops. So how do you get here? You can get here by car, bus, train, but also by ferry. See our website to book online.